All right, well, I'm just going to give the introduction before we all get into our conversations. My name is Heather Bakken, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Canadian Club of Ottawa this year. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to the luncheon and to hearing from our guest speaker. For those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with us, our mission at the Canadian Club of Ottawa is to offer timely public affairs discussions to inform, engage, and inspire. We achieve this through high-level discourse with the builders, the thinkers, and the dreamers who are shaping Canada's future and defining our place in an ever-changing world. This season, our overarching theme is open mindsets, with a focus on open business, open government, and open society. Our goal is to explore a range of policy issues with world-class leaders and newsmakers, and to share insights and expertise on an open future with open mindsets. At a time when sentiments are running high in parts of our diverse federation, I'm delighted there's a forum, such as this one, that brings people together to hear from leaders who are at the center of significant debates. Today is one of those days. We're delighted to have a very special keynote speaker, the Honourable Jason Kenney, Premier of Alberta. We are very grateful the Premier was able to make time to address the Canadian Club of Ottawa during a very busy trip to Ottawa alongside his senior caucus members. Thank you very much, Premier. We are very grateful, and we appreciate it. More on our special guests later as the lunch progresses, but first I would like to thank our piper, Graham Ogilvie, for leading today's head table procession. Thank you, Graham. Now I would like to present our head table. I ask that each guest stand and remain standing, please, until we've introduced everyone, and for the audience to please refrain from applause until everybody is standing at the table. So first, I would like to introduce Howard Anglin, Principal Secretary to the Premier of Alberta. Howard, please stand up. Please stand up. Martin Russ, Canadian Club Treasurer and Board Member. Isabelle Deschênes, Executive Vice President of the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada. Jamie Huckabee, Chief of Staff to the Premier of Alberta. Bob Masterson, President and CEO of the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada. Thomas DeKino, Chairman of Thomas DeKino Capital and Founder, Chairman, and Chief Executive of InterCouncil Limited. And the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and of course the Honourable Jason Kenney, Premier of Alberta. Ladies and gentlemen, your head table. So we like to keep our introductions fairly brief. We all understand the time pressures we are under, so I just have to do a little teeny bit of housekeeping and that will be it. I would like to thank our sponsors. Our premier sponsor for today's event is the Chemistry Association of Canada, enabled us to put this together and provide you with top-notch service, so thank you very much. Our annual corporate sponsor is the Royal Bank of Canada. We would not be able to complete the season without their support, so we thank you for continuing to support us. We really appreciate it. Our season sponsors are Maxis Staffing and Consulting, Polytechnics Canada, Gowling WLG, Strategy Corp, and Welsh LLP. Again, thank you for your continued support. Today's event's supporter is the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association, and our partners this season are the Hill Times, the Ottawa Business Journal, and Impact Public Affairs, which manages and coordinates this event. Big round of applause for them, please. Thank you very much. As is the occasion at this time of year, we were regaled with music from the Stevens and Kennedy Trio. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for regaling us, and I hope you enjoy your lunch. And as is our custom, we recognize the diplomatic community and elected officials from all levels of government. Regrettably, I apologize in advance, but today's list is very long, so that's about it. I will have to read off the names and then we'll get to it. So in addition to the elected officials already introduced, we have the Alberta Minister of Justice, Doug Schweitzer, Alberta Minister of Finance, Travis Taves, Alberta Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, Alberta Ministry of Children's Services, Rebecca Schultz, Alberta Minister of Environment, Jason Nixon, Alberta Minister of Indigenous Relations, Rick Wilson, Alberta Minister of Labour and Immigration, Jason Copping, Alberta Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, Devin Dreeshen, Deputy Head of Mission of the Netherlands Embassy in Ottawa, Frederica Kispel, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Member of Parliament Dane Lloyd, Member of Parliament Damien Currick, Member of Parliament Scott Reid, and Ottawa City Councillor Alan Hubley. Thank you very much. We pride ourselves at being at the intersection of business and government, and that is a very impressive list. For those of you who are going to be using social media today, please remember to use the hashtag Canadian Club Ottawa. Canadian is abbreviated CDN, CDN Club Ottawa, and that's also where you'll find us on Twitter if you'd like to follow us and include the handle @Canadian Club Ottawa. And finally, before we begin the meal, I would like to invite Martin Rust. Are you here already, Martin? Here you are, our treasurer, to propose a toast to Canada.
I think before I do that, I'm going to instill our long Canadian Club tradition and call upon our very dear friend, Corporal Craig Kennedy, to lead us off with the national anthem. Craig?
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command, car ton bras sait porter l'épée, il sait porter la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Well, while you're all still standing, I'll be brief. You know, the Canadian Club of Ottawa has often been at the intersection of the most important issues facing our country. Captains of industry, civic leaders, leaders of First Nations, ministers, and indeed First Ministers have come to this podium to discuss, debate, and provoke on the issues that face our nation. Today is no exception. As I think back about the history of this club and our nation, I am indeed thankful. Thankful for the freedoms we enjoy, the blessings that we have in this country, our history, our rich cultural fabric, the people, our natural resources, and all that unites us as Canadians. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please join with me and raise your glass in a toast to our great nation, to Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your lunch.
to be here for today, Alberta's 18th Premier, Jason Kenney. And also, before I go on, very pleased to have the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, join us as well. And only good things happen when Ottawa and Alberta work together, so thank you. Premier Kenney represents the constituents of Calgary-Lougheed in the Alberta Legislature. He's also a leader with intimate knowledge of this city and the Government of Canada. He served as federal minister in the key portfolios of citizenship, immigration and multiculturalism, employment and social development, and defence. Before turning the podium over to the Premier, let me just say a few words about the important work his government's doing to attract investment and strengthen Alberta's economy. And I'm dead sure, as the Premier himself is about to tell you, when good things happen in Alberta, good things happen for all of Canada. Our chemistry sector is an important component of the national economy. We produce and generate nearly $60 billion in annual shipments every year. And we're especially important to the Alberta economy, where we're the largest manufacturing sector with thousands of highly skilled, highly paid jobs. But most importantly, a fast-growing sector. We have about $15 billion of new investment underway in Canada, and the largest part of that, $12 billion of new capital investments underway in Alberta alone. And Alberta is set to attract an even larger share of global chemistry investments in the months and years to come. Just recently, Premier Kenney and his government reaffirmed its commitment to the Petrochemicals Diversification Program, and that initiative alone is expected to generate $20 billion of new investments in the province. Those investments, of course, will also increase provincial and federal government revenues and generate broadly distributed wealth across the entire nation. Not stopping there, the province is further strengthening the business environment for all Alberta industries. And it's quite a list of accomplishments for 7 brief months in power, but let me just name a few things that Premier Kenney and his ministers have been doing. Decreasing corporate taxes, matching the federal accelerated capital cost allowance for rapid depreciation of new investments, developing a climate change program that makes sense for Alberta industry but also meets federal expectations, taking actions to reducing red tape, and even in the last few weeks, changing the Municipal Government Act in Alberta so that municipalities can take action and attract investment on their own terms. So those efforts, combined with the province's attractive, low-carbon resource base, its highly skilled workforce, that provides unlimited potential to grow the chemistry sector in the province, to meet global market needs, and to also grow investment in other sectors. That's a significant number of accomplishments, again, for a government that's only been in power for 7 months, and we thank both the Premier, but also his many ministers, too many to recount, but all the many ministers that are here with him today. Thank you, ministers. So with that, please do join me in welcoming Premier Kenney to the podium. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate that. Thank you so much to the Canadian Club for welcoming me back to this podium for a second time. It's been a few years. I must say it's always great to see here my good friend, Don Newman, my favorite bon vivant, raconteur, and master teller of tales. Good to see you, Don. You're always welcome to visit us in Alberta. I also wanted to thank Dwayne Ogilvie for that beautiful bagpipe rendition of the Maple Leaf Forever. As a patriot and a traditionalist, I love that song, and I'd like to ask Bob perhaps to pipe me out to the tune Alberta Bound. Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, so much for being here. I have to say, Albertans are very proud to have a Deputy Prime Minister born and raised in Peace River country, who understands Alberta, and I truly appreciate your presence, and I look forward to working with you in a spirit of searching common ground to ensure prosperity and opportunity for Albertans and all Canadians. Thank you to the Canadian Club for the chance to bring an urgent message on behalf of Albertans, that there cannot be a strong Canada without a strong Alberta. Alberta has been the great engine of prosperity, social mobility, and shared wealth in modern Canada. But our ability to play that role in the future is at risk. That puts Canada's prosperity at risk and weakens our country's unity. That's why I'm here today with Team Alberta, an unprecedented mission of 8 ministers and 11 deputy ministers to press for a fair deal for Alberta in the Canadian Federation now. On ne peut pas avoir un Canada fort sans un Alberta fort. Alberta est un des plus grands moteurs de prospérité, mobilité sociale et les richesses partagées dans l'histoire du Canada moderne. And c'est la raison pour laquelle je suis ici avec l'équipe Alberta, pour demander une entente juste pour l'Alberta dans la fédération. So to boil it right down, our idea of a fair deal is a federation that respects the original vision of our Constitution and that allows us to develop our resources, getting them to global markets at a fair price so we can continue to share jobs, wealth, and opportunity with the rest of Canada. Okay, I'll accept that. Let's start with the numbers. We have made a massive, oversized contribution to Canada's prosperity, and you can see some of this on the screens on the side. Research by economists Robert Mansell, Mukesh Khanal, and Jack Mintz concludes that Alberta has made a net contribution of $630 billion to the rest of Canada since 1961. In the last 11 years alone, the net transfer from Albertans to the rest of the country was $240 billion. That's a personal contribution to Canada of $55,000 from each and every Albertan. For perspective, that's 600% more than the net per capita contribution of British Columbians and Ontarians combined over the same period of time. On an annual basis, Alberta taxpayers contribute about $23 billion more in federal taxes than they get back in services, or about $5,400 per person per year. We're proud of that. We are proud to have helped our fellow Canadians when times have been good in Alberta and bad elsewhere. We are proud to have helped to build schools, hospitals, roads, to fund pensions, healthcare, and social programs from coast to coast. But Alberta's contribution to social progress and prosperity goes much deeper than just these fiscal transfers. We punch above our weight in every economic category. For example, StatsCan data shows that in 2018, despite all the challenges to our energy sector, it was by far the biggest export industry in Canada, exporting nearly twice the value of our next largest export industry, autos and auto parts. Alberta's largest industry, oil and gas, is also Canada's largest industry subsector, larger than banking and financial services, larger, 2.5 times larger than residential construction, and 4 times larger than telecommunications. And while we have only 12% of the country's population, Alberta typically generates 1/3 of the investment and 1/4 of the new jobs in Canada's economy. Canadians depend disproportionately on Alberta's energy sector for their own financial security, with retirement savings and pensions invested heavily in energy stocks that have been hit hard in recent years. Our energy sector has been Canada's greatest engine of social mobility, moving tens of thousands of people without formal post-secondary education into great middle-class careers. This is demonstrated by the work of University of Ottawa economist Miles Korak. He spent years analyzing intergenerational income mobility and plotting it on the map of Canada. Korak's work, and you can see the map here, Korak's work finds that Alberta is by far the best place in Canada to move from rags to riches, from the lowest income group to the highest. And believe you me, I know more than a few Alberta millionaires who have done just that. Alberta's dynamic economy enables people to overcome socioeconomic hurdles that are sometimes insurmountable in other parts of Canada. which is why so many have moved to Alberta over the years. It's also why we enjoy by far the highest levels of Indigenous employment and the highest incomes amongst Indigenous Canadians, and better economic outcomes for immigrants and refugees as well. Alan Freeman, the longtime economics reporter, who's now a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, wrote the following, quotes, "In the 2 decades between 1994 and 2014, Alberta's GDP grew by an average of 3.5% a year. The province, with something over 11% of Canada's population, accounted for 25% of the new jobs for the entire country in the 10 years to 2014. Resource companies, led by the oil sands producers, invested $126 billion in their facilities, accounting for almost half of all non-residential capital investment in Canada." He went on to say, "We all benefited. Revenues from Alberta flowed into federal coffers, boosting overall growth, allowing Canada to avoid the worst of the Great Recession of 2008-9. Alberta provided a huge safety valve for surplus labor from other parts of the country. Tens of thousands of skilled and not so skilled workers from the Atlantic provinces, Quebec and Ontario, flocked to Fort McMurray for the high wages, sending money home like immigrants providing remittances to their families abroad," unquote. If not for Alberta's huge tax contributions, by the way, even during these tough recent years, Ottawa's deficits would be far worse than they are. Federal Finance Department data shows that without Alberta's net contributions in just the last 5 years, when we've been basically in a recession, the federal debt would be almost $100 billion higher than it currently is. In other words, sum it all up, Alberta has been the goose that laid the golden egg in the modern Canadian economy and for our system of fiscal federalism. But our ability to continue playing that nation-building role is in real jeopardy today as we live through our 5th year of economic stagnation and decline. Our economy is still $3 billion smaller today than it was in 2014. Between 2014 and 2018, business bankruptcies rose by more than 50%. And it looks like 2019 will be another record year for bankruptcies and foreclosures in Alberta. Oil and gas investment is forecasted to contract for the 5th consecutive year in 2019, down almost 60% from 2014 levels. There has been, it is estimated, a $100 billion loss in market value of publicly listed oil and gas companies since 2014, making Canadian pensioners poorer. Of 129 independent Canadian listed oil and gas companies in 2014, this is shocking, almost half of those have seen their market cap decline by 90% or have been sold, delisted, or gone through an insolvency event. This has been devastating for Canada's financial industry, and there's not a pension owner in this country that's not been affected by it. Family incomes still haven't recovered, and our per capita GDP is down 13% overall. For years, we have been running the biggest provincial deficits in Canada, the fastest growing debt, and for years our unemployment rate has been above the national average, with Calgary and Edmonton having the 2nd and 4th highest unemployment rates for large Canadian cities. The extent of this jobs crisis is obscured by tens of thousands of folks leaving the workforce, especially young men, and many, many folks leaving the province as well. It's estimated that we have lost something like 80,000 high-paying energy sector jobs. To put that in perspective, just think about this for a moment. Recall all of the media attention, quite rightfully focused on the tragic loss of 3,000 jobs at the GM plant in Oshawa. And Albertans felt a sense of solidarity for those people. But that occupied the better part of a week of national attention, and rightfully so. Have we given anything like proportionate attention to the 80,000 energy workers who have lost their jobs in Alberta. These are stark statistics, but beneath them are the human costs, which are the ultimate source of the fear and anger that are roiling the prairies. Everywhere I go, I see the fear of people affected by this downturn. Business owners hanging on by the skin of their teeth with nowhere left to cut. Local municipal councillors struggling to pay for public services as local tax revenues dry up. CEOs with exhausted lines of credit who can't raise equity, grimly contemplating a third or fourth round of layoffs. Police officers, social workers, healthcare providers, overwhelmed by the explosion of homelessness, crime, depression, and addiction. This could not be more serious. Some rural counties have experienced a 400% increase in crime. More families are breaking up. Food banks and women's shelters have never had more demand. Alberta increased its support for women's shelters by 50% last year, and they are already indicating that they do not have enough space. The per capita, and this is very grave, the per capita suicide rate in Alberta is 50% higher than here in Ontario. And according to research from the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, for every 1% increase in the unemployment rate, we have seen 16 more people take their lives. So why is all of this happening? Well, here in central Canada, there seems to be a misunderstanding amongst some of what has caused this prolonged downturn in Alberta and Saskatchewan and more generally in Canada's energy sector. Every day I read columns and commentaries suggesting that we're just the hapless victims of global commodity prices, or that we're witnessing the end of oil and gas as an industry, and apparently, according to some of this commentary, we Albertans are just too dense to grasp this, and so we're just lashing out in frustration to Ottawa. But enough about the editorial pages of the Toronto Star. So let me take on each of these misconceptions. First off, oil prices are not low. They're average. It's true that in 2014 there was a sudden drop from $100 to $50 oil, but prices have stabilized, with the current benchmark West Texas Intermediate at around $60 a barrel, which is well within the range of historical norms, as you can see on this chart. In fact, it's higher than the average price since the modern Alberta oil boom began in 1947, and higher than the average price that we've experienced since 1980. Now, because of the 2014 price correction, Canadian producers have cut costs by about 1/3, becoming more efficient than ever. Most of our major oil sands producers will tell you that they can operate profitably now at $35 prices for West Texas. At the same time, and at the same prices, we have seen a huge oil and gas boom south of the border and in many other parts of the world. Global production of oil is up 10 million barrels a day over the past decade. Much of that is being supplied by the United States, which has more than doubled output to become the world's largest oil producer, and for the first time in history, an exporter. Much of that production down there was fueled by tens of billions of dollars moving from Canada, specifically Alberta, to the Permian, Eagle Ford, and Bakken basins in the U.S. So while Alberta is in its 4th year of a jobs crisis, energy states like Texas, Oklahoma, and North Dakota are at full employment, experiencing sustained economic booms. So friends, Albertans submit that the difference is not price, it is policy. Policies that have made our industry less and less competitive, driving job-creating investment out of this country. And policies that have killed and delayed pipelines mean that we are captive to the U.S. and sell one of our country's most valuable assets to them at fire sale prices, subsidizing massive profits for U.S. refineries. It's like taking our family jewels to the pawn shop. According to Scotiabank, this price differential costs the Canadian economy about $16 billion a year. A year ago, it became so extreme that we were selling Canadian oil to the U.S. at $10 a barrel, and they were selling their oil to the world at $60 a barrel. This forced the government of Alberta to impose production caps on our crude as a last resort, which in turn has driven away investment as producers cannot sell additional production. So yes, a decline in global prices did hit us 5 years ago. But Alberta has been through that before, and we bounced back. We are resilient, and we are innovative. But this time, something was different. Government policies made a bad situation much worse. Policies from different levels of government, like the cancellation of the approved Northern Gateway pipeline, the surrender to a U.S. presidential veto on Keystone XL, the killing of Energy East by changing the regulatory requirements halfway through the process, by constant uncertainty and delays around the Trans Mountain expansion that caused Kinder Morgan to leave the country, to an endless and uncertain approval process which contributed to the cancellation of projects like Petronas's $40 billion West Coast LNG project, which would have been the largest direct foreign investment in Canadian history. Carbon taxes and regulations that are not imposed by any other major energy producer on Earth, which have had the effect of accelerating carbon leakage and capital flight. And now, the deeply problematic bills C-48 and C-69. One of them, 48, is a first, I believe, in Canadian history, a ban on the export of only one export product, bitumen, produced in only one province, Alberta. So while Saudi tankers can enter the Bay of Fundy every day unimpeded with their carbon tax-free conflict oil, we are barred from sending Canadian energy out of certain Canadian ports, even if we have the support of First Nations, as we do in many cases in northern British Columbia. That's why the Senate Transportation Committee voted to defeat Bill C-48, a decision that was subsequently reversed. And Bill C-69, the new Impact Assessment Act, is known in Alberta as the No More Pipelines Law. It creates enormous new uncertainty, potentially endless reviews, was opposed by almost every major industry group in the country, was opposed by 9 of the 10 provincial governments, by many First Nations, most of those in Alberta, and by all 5 political parties in my province. The majority of senators, including those appointed by the current Prime Minister, and a majority of the Liberal Senate caucus, voted to adopt virtually all of the amendments to Bill C-69 proposed by Alberta's government under the NDP and by the Canadian energy industry. But ultimately, these 180 amendments were reversed. C-69 not only creates huge new uncertainty for the future of Canada's resource industries at the worst possible time, it also constitutes, we believe, a blatant constitutional intrusion into our exclusive provincial jurisdiction to control the development of our resources. That power was hard fought for and won by one of my great predecessors, Peter Lougheed, during the debates around the patriation of the Constitution in 1981. And Alberta's signature on the Constitution is there only because we secured Section 92A as a condition precedent of our concurrence with the Constitution's patriation in 1981, giving provinces exclusive authority to regulate the production of their natural resources, something that Bill C-69 flagrantly violates, which is why we are seeking a judicial reference to the Alberta Court of Appeal to challenge its constitutionality. On top of those policies, we heard the leader of the national government speak during the last election campaign when he said, et pendant la campagne électorale récente, il a dit que, je cite, on a besoin d'un gouvernement qui va lutter contre les pétrolières. He said, quotes, we need a government that will fight the big oil companies. Now, I get that rhetoric happens in elections, and I hope that we can, starting with my meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow, move beyond this and find common ground. I hope he will demonstrate his intention to do so through actions. But I just have to ask you this. Can you imagine a national leader of any party on live television saying, we need a government that will fight the big auto manufacturers? Or we need a government that will fight the big aviation companies? It is unthinkable and rightfully so. Can you imagine a government during a prolonged downturn in Quebec, with tensions running high, bringing legislation that imperils Quebec's largest industry? I sat around a federal cabinet table. I think that would be implausible. Again, rightfully so. Et je dis, comme j'ai dit, la soirée de notre victoire électorale en avril, les Albertains sont depuis toujours les alliés du Québec dans la défense du champ des compétences des provinces. Et j'espère qu'à nouveau, nous serons les partenaires en prospérité. Nous avons établi une bonne relation avec le gouvernement du Premier ministre Legault. Et je suis très reconnaissant de son appui pour la situation de l'Alberta au Conseil de la Fédération la semaine dernière. Friends, these are reasons why we have seen a disturbing rise in alienation on the Canadian prairies, and particularly in Alberta. You'll have seen polls indicating support running as high as 32% for leaving the Federation. Let me be clear. I am and always will be an unconditional and proud Canadian patriot. Our government will always be a federalist government. The new party, which I'm privileged to lead, not by accident, wrote into its founding principles that we believe we are devoted to a united Canada. And I believe that despite our flaws, Canada is the best country in the world. And my patriotism will never be conditional. Nor do I understand, quite frankly, how the solution to a campaign that's trying to landlock Alberta is for Alberta voluntarily to landlock itself. Doesn't make sense to me. Having said that, what concerns me most in the polling is the indication that upwards of 80% of my fellow Albertans say they, quote, understand or sympathize with the separatist sentiment. These are good people, the vast majority of whom I do not believe would ever opt to leave our country. They have not given up on Canada, but more and more they believe that Canada has given up on them. And so I am here with my colleagues from Cabinet to convey a message to the newly re-elected federal government and parliamentarians from across party lines. Let us take seriously these challenges in a province that has done so much to build this country to be an engine of social mobility, of progress, of prosperity. Let us not make the mistake of diminishing or deriding these voices of frustration, the experiences of so many proud Albertans. My province's population has doubled in the past 3 decades, in large part because of people from every corner of Canada joining us in what they saw as an opportunity society. The 80% who I just cited, and some of the 32% that I referred to, many of those people, hundreds of thousands of them, were born and raised in Ontario and Quebec and Atlantic Canada and British Columbia. They moved from the despair of poverty and unemployment or underemployment in the fishery of the East Coast, or the traditional manufacturing industries of central Canada, or the forestry in British Columbia, to enjoy opportunity in Alberta. They are Canadians profoundly and deeply, and yet this is what they feel: a sense of having been marginalized in the Federation. And so I'm encouraged by the appointment of Deputy Prime Minister Friedland as Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and our initial productive conversations, and the fact that many members of her cabinet have reached out to my colleagues to open a dialogue about issues affecting Alberta's future. But I'm also here to say that we need to see not just dialogue, we need to see some meaningful action. And that is why we are focused on first of all, we launched a fair deal consultation with Albertans to look at whether or how Alberta should begin to use some of the powers exercised by Quebec and Ontario, for example. We are not a marginal regional province. Demographers project that we will, in the not too distant future, exceed British Columbia as the 3rd most populous province. Until recently, we had the 2nd largest economy in Canada, until this downturn. And so we will be studying a whole range of ways in which we can more effectively exercise our powers as a province. to defend our vital economic interests within the Federation. But I'm here today focused on 5 key urgent priorities for Alberta. Firstly, we are seeking a firm, fixed, and fast deadline to complete the Trans Mountain expansion to get Canadian oil moving to new markets so we can bring investment and jobs back to Canada. I'm specifically asking the government to commit to upholding and enforcing the rule of law to ensure that this happens, and to make it a priority to bring First Nations into the project as equity partners as quickly as possible. And on this, we in Alberta are leading by example. We have just passed through the legislature the creation of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, backstopped by $1 billion of the faith and credit of the Alberta Crown to facilitate Aboriginal financial participation in and co-ownership of major resource projects, including prospectively pipelines, because we think it is an economic imperative. It would be a game changer in terms of completion of major projects. But we also recognize that it is a moral imperative of our generation to help our Indigenous people benefit from the resources that lie below the ground that their ancestors first inhabited. And we hope the federal government will join us in that. And so we do hope to make forward progress on that. The second thing I will be raising this week with my colleagues in Ottawa is asking for payments that we should have received during the height of our downturn under something called the Fiscal Stabilization Program, a kind of, the way I explain it to folks, is a sort of equalization rebate designed to soften a sudden decline in revenues, typically for HAV provinces. Alberta suffered a $7 billion revenue drop in 2015, due mainly to the world energy price collapse. But because of a per capita ceiling put on that program many years ago, we've only received $250 million. And so we will be seeking, with the unanimous support of every province and territory expressed in the communique of the Council of the Federation last week, and I'm so grateful to my colleagues for having, all of them have urgent issues. But in that communique, they decided to focus on 3 main issues, one of which was market access for Canadian resources, working with the federal government to undo the problematic aspects of Bill C-69 and the Federal Impact Assessment Act, and then lifting the cap retroactively on the Fiscal Stabilization Program. And Minister Freeland, I can assure you that if the federal government decides to do that, to recognize the huge adversity of my province, that we will put those funds to good use, helping to create good blue-collar jobs in areas like reclaiming abandoned wells that will help to improve our environment at the same time. Thirdly, we seek the repeal of Bill C-48 and Bill C-69. Recognizing that the latter is unlikely, we will hope the government will work with us constructively to mitigate the uncertainty created by that bill, for example, on the project list. I'll give you one example. We've got a huge conversion from coal to natural gas-fired power going on in Alberta right now. But in order to make that happen, the electricity companies need to build pipelines to bring natural gas into their electricity plants. And unfortunately, if they're a certain length, they fall under the federal aegis under Bill C-69 of the Impact Act, and that's taking years to get to an approval. So here we have the private sector with the support of the provincial government trying to do something that will materially reduce CO2 emissions, and we're caught up in a bureaucratic morass. These are practical, simple things that we can do together. Another thing that we believe must be done is to get to a positive approval of the Teck Resources mine in northern Alberta that would create thousands of jobs, that has multiple deep partnerships with First Nations and Indigenous communities. And I see Herb here from the Métis Nation in Alberta, from the Métis people as well. I'm not sure if you've heard of Chief Alan Adam. Alan is the chief of the Fort Chippewa First Nation. Alan has, in the past, toured Leo DiCaprio and James Cameron and Jane Fonda around the Alberta oil sands. Chief Adam has given his conditional support to the Tech Resources Mine because he sees it as an opportunity to move his people from poverty to prosperity. And if this project does not proceed, it would be a clear indication that there is no way forward for this country's largest natural resource. My fourth request of the government, which I know will be echoed by Finance Minister Travis Toews in his meeting with Minister Morneau, will be an expansion of tax instruments like flow-through shares to simulate job-creating investment in resource-related activities. Flow-through shares are a proven tool to accelerate job-creating investment, and we're asking the federal government to expand them to include activities that will improve the environmental performance of our energy sector, such as carbon capture projects and decommissioning of spent oil and gas wells. Again, I think that I really believe that on these issues, we can find common ground with a federal government that is very much focused on middle-class jobs, environmental protection, and prosperity for Indigenous people. We share these points in common in our agenda. Let's find ways of acting on those shared priorities. And my final urgent request to the Prime Minister tomorrow will be an equivalency recognition for Alberta's methane reduction regulations. Earlier this week, is it today, Monday? Okay, excuse me, it's all a blur. On Friday, I want to commend and thank the Government of Canada for having announced an equivalency agreement for our levy on major industrial emitters, the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Plan, and we ask that a similar consideration be given to our very rigorous methane rules, which according to a study co-sponsored by the federal government would reduce more emissions than the federal regulations at a significantly lower cost. So we ask that be considered. Let me conclude with a final appeal to those who persist in seeing our insistence on a fair deal as selfish or parochial. People who feel that way, I believe, completely misunderstand the Alberta spirit. In our hearts, Albertans are patriotic and generous. So if a growing number of Albertans see themselves as not fully at home in their country, a country they have so dutifully served and to which they have contributed disproportionately, then it is the responsibility of all Canadians, but especially the national government, to address that. Let me leave you with the words of a man who spoke at last week's first town hall meeting conducted by our Fair Deal panel. I don't know this man, he stood up and talked about having fought for Canada in Afghanistan, probably with the PPCLI. After leaving the forces, he found good paying work in the oil patch. That job took him to Chad in Africa, where he proudly reported that his Canadian company followed exemplary environmental, social, and governance standards. He said, quotes, "I built roads, I built power, I built a future for those people. I saw a country coming alive because they had industry and hope," unquote. Upon returning to Alberta, he lost his job and has been out of work for the past 2 years. Here's how he feels today, quotes, "Just because we're right, just because we have the right to demand to be treated fairly does not mean that they'll automatically treat us fairly. If you want to do something, you have to be able to stand up and say, I deserve this and I'm going to fight for this," unquote. I couldn't have said it any better. It's what I hear everywhere I go across my province. I hear that we've been working for Ottawa for too long and it's time for Ottawa to help work for Alberta. That Ottawa needs to stop making it harder for us to jumpstart our economy. And so here I am with a third of our cabinet in Ottawa to deliver that message on behalf of Albertans. Albertans are practical people. We're not unreasonable. Nothing we're asking for here is unreasonable. Everything we're asking for is within the federal government's power, and none of it would hurt another province. Indeed, we saw many of these items endorsed unanimously last week. We are simply asking for a fair deal now within Canada, one that respects the Constitution and lets us do what we do best, what Albertans have always done: grow our economy, get people to work, and generate an outsized share of Canada's wealth. That's what Albertans want, it's what we need, and we hope that's what we'll get in a fair deal within the Federation. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we've got 10 minutes to take questions. I'm sorry that went long. The truth be told, much to the frustration of my environment minister and some of my staff, I had to exercise about 10 pages about environmental, social, and governance. So if you got any questions about emissions, and I'm happy to take them.
Hello, is this hot? Great. I just want to warn everyone that the one who controls the mic controls the question. So I'm going to hand this over to Al at Impact. We're going to roam the room. Please keep your questions very brief so more people can have a chance to ask the Premier what they would like to ask them. Thank you very much.
We'll also have another mic over here with Madison.
Thank you, Premier Kenney, and welcome back to Ottawa. You asked if we have questions about emissions. I do. My question is, what are your views, if you'd like to share with us, on the recent appointment of Mark Carney as UN Special Envoy for climate action and climate finance? And do you think there would be areas of collaboration and cooperation, or is that asking for too much? Thank you.
Well, I think there may be. In fact, I'm hoping to see my friend Governor Carney in London as early as next week. He might be otherwise preoccupied following the UK elections, but I do hope at some point to have a chance to chat with Mark about his new responsibility. And I will share with him that I believe part of the answer to the challenges we face on climate change can be found in Canada's energy industry. Bear with me a moment. According to the International Energy Agency, their best projection based on a status quo policy setting is for the world to be consuming 110 million barrels per day of crude oil in 2040 and about a 35% increase in natural gas consumption by then. According to their most stringent, conservative or bearish projection, based on a radical change of policy, meaning full compliance with Paris, they project 70 million barrels per day of consumption of crude oil in 2040. So that's their average projection is 110, their bearish projection is 70. That's just off 30% or 30 million barrels per day from where we are now. The question then is, who will be providing that oil? Because even if the whole world converted to electric cars, for example, only 25% of oil consumption is vehicles. To build lighter airplanes and faster and more efficient cars will require plastic products that is generated from the petroleum industry, for example. And so in that respect, I've got a great quote I was going to use from Bill Gates. In February of this year, he said, quotes, when asked about this, he said, let's stop joking around. This term clean energy, I think, has, quotes, screwed up people's minds. How are you going to run Tokyo on 22 gigawatts of electricity during a 3-day cyclone on a battery? No one is close to solving the problem of reliability. How are you going to make steel? Where is the fertilizer, the cement, the plastic? Where is it going to come from? Do planes fly through the sky because you put numbers on a spreadsheet? There is no substitute for how the industrial economy runs today, unquote. And I think what Mr. Gates, who supports renewable energy, was trying to say is, yes, there is a transition. There must be a transition. We agree with that in Alberta. We accept the imperative of combating climate change, and we want to work with the federal government on that. We are proud that our oil sands producers have reduced by 30% the carbon intensity of an average barrel of bitumen since the year 2000, and are credibly on track to reduce it by another 20%. We have major producers like CNRL and Meg Energy who have committed themselves publicly to net zero carbon on the energy that they produce. There is an entire new generation of technologies coming on stream, replacing water with solvents that will radically reduce energy consumption and water usage. Natural gas cogen as a power source, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage and sequestration. We have a carbon trunk line that we're building from a plant east of Edmonton, an upgrader to help with enhanced oil recovery. We have a sedimentary basin, which is one of the best geological formations in the world for carbon sequestration, CCUS is becoming, we believe, scalable. There's so much. And you know what? This stuff isn't happening by accident. It's Canada's energy industries that have invested tens of billions of dollars over the years in this kind of technology. So I would say, in a world where 70 million barrels is being consumed 20 years from now, I would rather that the last best barrel be produced by Canada instead of OPEC dictatorships, which have lower standards in every respect. And finally, this is particularly prescient on the question of liquefied natural gas. I understand that if we were to fully satisfy the future demand for LNG in China and India to allow them to convert off of high-emitting coal to much lower-emitting natural gas, that the incremental reduction in their CO2 output would be equivalent to the entire Canadian economy's GHG output. So I hope that the federal government will seek to get credit for that kind of export through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We'd like to work with them on that. I could go on, but the point is this. In the real world of which Bill Gates speaks, we all have an imperative to constantly do better. We are leading. Alberta was the first jurisdiction in North America to have a price on carbon, which we just increased with our major emitters levy. So I don't want anybody to leave with the impression that we are being careless about the environmental imperative, but we think that at the end of the day, we should be the last best source of that kind of energy. Other questions? I'm sorry, that was a long one. But that was a condensation of 10 minutes in my speech here, so.
Good afternoon. My name is Krishnan Suthantiran. I met you earlier. 15 years ago, I bought a town called Kitsalt in British Columbia. It's on the fjord of Alisab. In 2013, January, I was the first one to announce a dedicated energy corridor, port and terminal at Kitsalt. Since then, several pipelines to Kitsalt, or through Kitsalt, has been approved. And I met a number of folks at a senior level at the CAPS, EAPP, and CEPA, but I just find that they don't seem to have any vision about how to get it done. We can bring crude oil and natural gas to Kitsalt pipeline because the pipeline for natural gas has already been approved, and I'm not getting the kind of support and encouragement from CEPA and CAP and other energy companies in Alberta, even though Canadian and international energy companies spent more than $20 billion, and yet not a single pipeline has been built. So this is much better than a Kinamargan Trans Mountain pipeline, and the cost will be significantly less. India and China are begging to buy the products.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Krishnan. You know, I first met Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat in 2007, I believe, in Ahmedabad. And after thanking me for coming there, the next thing he said was, how quickly can we get your Canadian liquefied natural gas? He was building a huge LNG import facility at that time in Gujarat, which, as you know, is northwest India. And unfortunately, here we are 12 years later, not 1 inch closer. And he has to import his LNG primarily from Qatar, a regime which finances extremism and indirectly terrorism, which sometimes targets India. That's why he so desperately wants Canadian LNG. So thank you for championing your project, Kitsalt Energy. And let me just say, I really believe that LNG can be a nation-building project. We need to be audacious about this. We have all 10 provincial governments, all 3 territorial governments of all partisan stripes in favor of LNG. I have my disagreements with Premier Legault about a prospective crude pipeline to the East Coast, but he is clearly in favor of the 2 proposed LNG export facilities, including Energy Saguenay, because he sees the role that it could play not only in creating jobs at home, but in displacing CO2 emissions abroad. The new Democrat government of British Columbia strongly in favor of facilitating additional LNG export projects, and almost every First Nation Indigenous group in British Columbia synced up with that. So you have, I mean, how often does that happen in this federation? You get parties from right across the spectrum, provincial and territorial governments, and First Nations lined up on an issue of the development of resources that can also be beneficial to the global environment. I think we should seize this opportunity to advance projects like yours. Oh, very good. Sorry for going so long. That was definitely not, Christia, the 30-second answered limit and question period. I'm sorry. No, I'm glad not to.
Mr. Premier, I'm sure we could listen to you for the rest of the afternoon. And as I listen to you, I'm certainly struck by the complexity of the Alberta economy and by the Canadian economy and by the impact of that complexity on all of us, on our Canadian society, on the very human issues, and all of us as human beings and all of Canadians. And I am very thankful for your leadership and for challenging leadership across the country to think differently. I'm thankful for provoking the public discourse, for provoking the public debate. I'm thankful that you're here today, and on behalf of the Canadian Club of Ottawa and all of us in this room today, thank you for being here. Thank you. Very grateful for you.
single biggest thing that Canada could do to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. We should not make the mistake of looking at Canada as kind of as though we live under a sealed biodome. We are part of the global environment, and the huge increases in emissions are coming from China and India, where they're still building high-emitting coal-fired plants. We can help them change that by shifting to natural gas, which is a massive reduction in emissions, and we should fight for credit for that. So I regret it. I hope he's not surrendering Canada's interest before even getting to the Madrid conference. I think the role of the government is to fight for our country's economic and environmental interests. And this is a unique moment where, as I said just now, you have parties from the BC New Democrats to Alberta Conservatives to the CAQ in Quebec. You have East Coast, Nova Scotia LNG proposals, Quebec LNG proposals, West Coast LNG proposals, supported by all of the provincial and territorial governments, overwhelmingly by First Nations and by Canadians, and they make sense for the environment. So I would encourage the new minister to take a closer look at that. J'espère que oui. Écoutez, la semaine en mai, tout de suite après que je suis devenu Premier ministre en mai, j'ai rencontré M. Trudeau ici pour dire que j'espérais on pouvait trouver la terre commune. Et j'ai mentionné plusieurs enjeux. Aujourd'hui, j'ai souligné plusieurs enjeux sur lesquels je crois que nous pouvons travailler ensemble avec le fédéral pour le pays. J'ai dit que nous partageons l'emphase du gouvernement Trudeau en ce qui concerne réduction de gaz à effet de serre, inclusion économique des Canadiens autochtones et croissance d'emplois et croissance économique. Alors, je crois on peut trouver une certaine entente, mais il faut voir un espace de flexibilité ici au gouvernement fédéral. J'ai eu une très bonne discussion avec Madame le sous-premier ministre Friedland, ça fait 2 semaines, et plusieurs ministres fédéraux ont appelé leur homologue albertain tout de suite après de leur nomination. J'espère que ça, c'est un bon début. Mais comme j'ai dit, il faut voir l'action, pas seulement les mots. I'll go ahead with you and then...
Sur ces 69, vous en avez parlé pendant le discours, justement, parlant d'ouverture. Est-ce que ça serait suffisant à vos yeux, des modifications à la façon de le mettre en œuvre? M. Carr a suggéré que ce ne serait pas de réécrire un projet de loi, mais de peut-être voir dans le implementation du projet de loi. Est-ce que ça, à vos yeux, ça serait suffisant?
C'est clair, notre préférence est de retirer le projet de loi C-69. Pour nous autres, c'est un désastre au pire moment pour les industries de ressources naturelles, pas seulement de pétrole et de gaz. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle le Sénat, y compris la majorité des sénateurs nommés par M. Trudeau, le caucus libéral, 9 des 10 provinces, presque tous les organismes de commerce au Canada, se sont opposés à ce projet de loi. Cela étant dit, c'est devenu la loi et au moins, nous espérons que le fédéral va considérer certaines modifications au texte de la loi et changements dans les réglementations, y compris la liste des projets. Pour nous, c'est insupportable d'avoir dans la liste des projets les sites in situ, ça veut dire pour les sables bitumineux, parce que ça c'est clairement les juridictions provinciales selon 92A de la Constitution. Ça c'est pour nous totalement inacceptable et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous allons à la Cour à cet égard. Mais peut-être il y a certains autres enjeux sur lesquels nous pouvons travailler, mais je parle au nom de toutes les provinces et territoires. On a eu une motion unanime la semaine dernière dans le Conseil de la Fédération à cet égard.
Je veux juste préciser parce que vous dites j'aimerais ça avoir des modifications au texte de loi et des changements à la réglementation.
Ouais, notre but sera l'acceptation des modifications législatives qui ont été proposées par le gouvernement de l'Alberta néo-démocrate et qui ont été acceptées par le Sénat. Mais ben, si le fédéral refuse de le considérer, au moins un changement de réglementation.
So that was basically what I was going to ask, but the ministers have already said they're not actually going to amend the law in any respect, that they are open to compromising on the implementation of the law. What implementation compromise are you
Well,
prepared to accept?
at the very least, they have to keep projects that touch on the development of resources in the province off of their project list, because that is a gross and obvious violation of the letter of the Constitution, Section 92A. Secondly, we would like them to exempt from the project list anything that helps us to reduce emissions. I'll give you an example. We're just trying to build some gas pipelines to convert coal-fired electricity plants to natural gas that would help us to significantly reduce CO2 emissions in Alberta. Why wait? Why reg the puck? Why put that through a ridiculous bureaucratic process? Thirdly, was already in the pipeline before C-69 became law, but we do hope that they will accelerate a positive approval of the Tech Resources Mine that will create thousands of jobs, that has really robust partnerships with First Nations. It's stuff like that where I hope that we can find common ground.
Here's a waiver here. Last week we had the provinces all sit down and agree to a list. You're, I believe, one of the more high-profile last premiers to sit down with Justin Trudeau, and the first high-profile since this meeting. Are you closer? Are you the guys who are going to come in and try and get a deal? What's your measure of success?
My measure of success is to start to see some real action from the federal government, at least on the 5 issues that I outlined today. And the two of those were supported by all provincial governments and territorial governments last week. Those would be a retroactive lifting of the cap on the Fiscal Stabilization program, what I call an equalization rebate, and secondly, getting serious about fixing the huge problems with the C-69 environmental impact assessment. So those are things where you've got all the provinces on side across a huge partisan spectrum. I mean, how often does that happen? You got the province of Quebec defending Alberta on natural resources, and the NDP government of British Columbia and I agreeing. Like, this is a peace in the land is breaking out on some of these issues, and if I was the federal government, I would take that as a pretty strong prompt, a nudge to deliver. So I don't expect to be walking out of the Prime Minister's office with written agreements on these things tomorrow, but I sure hope that we get an indication that they're prepared to move on some of those things. What did you?
What's your position on Justin Trudeau's commitment to be net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
I don't oppose it. These are, I would categorize it as an aspirational target. We have major oil producers who have committed themselves to net zero production of petroleum by 2050, and they believe it's credible. We've been looking at whether it's prudent for us to make a commitment, but let me tell you the truth. I mean, on behalf of the government of Alberta, but I think there's enough cynicism in climate politics. I think people who are focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions have seen so many politicians over so many years create super ambitious targets without a real practical plan to achieve them. So to date, we're going to look at that very closely. We're studying the plans of CNRL and Meg Energy, seeing if that's credible more generally for the Alberta energy industry. So I don't oppose the net zero aspirational target, but the challenge for all of us is actually, and I think the solution is so much of this is technology, and a lot of that technology is funded by Alberta energy producers. Excusez? Par Brexit. Ils doivent être préoccupés par le sentiment en Alberta. Comme j'ai dit, 80% des Albertains disent dans les sondages qu'ils comprennent ou ils ont sympathie avec le sentiment de séparation. Un tiers, on dit dernièrement dans un sondage, il appuie le concept de séparation. 80% ont dit ils comprennent cet esprit, cette attitude. Ça veut dire que je crois que les Albertains seront toujours les patriotes. Je ne crois qu'il y aura un mouvement crédible pour faire séparer du pays. Mais on a une province importante pour l'économie, pour le pays, où 80% de la population sont que le Canada ne les respecte pas. Et ça, c'est un problème grave. Which is? I told the Prime Minister in May I'm prepared to talk to him about that. Wait. Je crois que si il y a eu une vote aujourd'hui, les Albertains voteront à rester dans le pays. Mais ils ne sont pas heureux. Comme j'ai dit, plus de 3/4 des Albertains sont assez fâchés de la situation dans la fédération. On ne doit pas l'ignorer. On ne doit pas permettre cette attitude à continuer à développer. Ça serait malheureux pour le futur de la fédération. Alors, comme j'ai dit, je suis fédéraliste, je serai fédéraliste à jamais. Mais does that make sense? My French, I'm sorry, je suis désolé, mon français est pénible. Mais je suis fédéraliste à jamais. Le problème, c'est que j'ai 80% de notre population qui croit que la proposition de séparation n'est pas irraisonnable. Et ça m'inquiète. OK. Well, the NDP government before us, the NDP government had proposed a 100 megaton cap on greenhouse gas emissions from the Alberta oil sands in exchange notionally for other things, including the guarantee of a completion of a pipeline. When we saw all the delays on TMX, Premier Notley retreated from that position. But what I've said is we are prepared to be pragmatic. I don't believe we're going to hit that cap because the intensity keeps coming down. So even if there's an increase in production, I believe that and most of our major oil sands producers believe they will not hit that number. Folks, I'm late for a meeting on the Hill. Thank you. I'll take these two. I'm sorry.
Say that, the idea that LNG from Canada would gain credits for Canada's climate
Yeah.
makes no sense because then at the same time we have to be getting debited or charged for our high carbon exports like
I'll refer you back to my earlier question. I think the role of the federal government is to fight for the country's best interests, which manifestly would be to get credit for the export of our. I think it does. I think Mr. Sohi agreed with me. Look, you've got all 13 provinces and territories who, in the July COF statement, called for use of Article 6 on LNG exports. You had the former Minister of Natural Resources.
My question is the economics of it. If we're going to get credits for our exports of low carbon fossil fuels, why wouldn't we have to count towards the opposite if we're exporting high carbon fuels?
Because Article 6 is designed to get credit for things that reduce emissions, and that's the subject of the conversation in Madrid in part this week.
Sur vos demandes pour demain, vous demandez une date de completion pour TMX, c'est quelle date? Sur le Fiscal Stabilization Fund, vous dites rétroactif. À quelle année et quel montant vous pensez que vous devriez recevoir?
Oui, nous voulons un remboursement rétroactif à 2014 pour le programme de stabilisation fiscale et pour le TMX. L'échéance pour le projet est 36 mois et ça c'est pour moi essentiel que nous le terminons parce que ça nous coûte du début de construction qui était la semaine dernière. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.